to Lesson 1, Cell Theory and Cell Types. Congratulations! You've made it through Unit 1, and now we're on to Unit 2. Unit 2 is going to be broken up into 4 lessons. Lesson 1 will be under Cell Theory and Cell Types. Lesson 2 will be mitosis. Lesson 3 will be meiosis. Lesson 4 will be cell reproduction. Have your packets out, and you're going to follow along as we learn more about cell theory and cell types today. Cell theory, a scientific theory first formulated in the 1800s by multiple scientists, Schwann, Schleiden, and Virchow. It forms one of the basic principles of biology. We know that all organisms are made of cells. We know that cells are the basic unit of life. And we also know that cells come from other pre-existing cells. And when we look at cells, when we look at a living organism, we can classify it. And one of the biggest classifications that we have, not the biggest, there's a domain that's right above kingdom, but we do have these kingdoms of life. And currently there's 6. I say that there are currently 6 is because in my time frame, actually there were 5. Archaebacteria and eubacteria were just blended in together with the Monera. And so we've learned through our technology that actually is incorrect, and we now have 6. So I always leave it open that science changes. The more technology we have, the more information we have. So these are the 6 kingdoms of life: archaebacteria, eubacteria, animals, plants, fungus, and protists. And the words written in parentheses, those are their scientific names. So sometimes, especially like let's say in zoology, we talk about the kingdom Animalia rather than the animal kingdom, or the plantae, kingdom plantae, or kingdom fungi, or kingdom protista. And kingdom of the ones that we use more frequently is the more general. We have tons of organisms in each individual kingdom. And as we move further down in classifying them, it gets more specific until we actually get to the species or the actual organism. Now, back to our very first part of cell theory. All living things are made of cells, and we need to talk about that. So in this case, cells is plural, but there are also organisms that are just made up of one cell. So in your notes, you have this table. We're going to fill it out. We'll focus on unicellular first and then multicellular. So entomology, that means how is the word made up? So uni, meaning uno, meaning one, and cell, meaning unit. So it really just means one cell. And that makes sense because the number of cells is 1. And here's the thing, if it's one-celled organism, that means that none of the cells can be specialized because there's only one cell. So there's no specialized cells in unicellular organisms. And there are pretty much the bacteria, they're all unicellular, but we do have some protists that are also unicellular. Now let's jump over to multicellular. Multi meaning many, cell meaning unit. This means that there's 2 or even as many as several trillion like in humans. Now these cells, because there's so many, these cells do have specializations. For example, we have skin cells and muscle cells and blood cells and eye cells and hair cells. And the kingdoms that are mainly with these are obviously our more complex kingdoms: animals, plants, fungi, and protists. So you'll see that protists is in both, not just unicellular, but also multicellular. But pretty much unicellular is mostly bacteria and protists, and then multicellular are going to be mainly eukaryotes, which we'll talk about that term next. Now, our next thing that we need to know with cell theory is cells are the basic unit of organisms. That means that it is the basic thing that makes everything up. Smaller than that, you have organelles, but not all organelles actually are in every single living thing. And we also have atoms of elements, but again, not every single atom of an element are in everything. But organisms that are living do have cells. So every cell consists of cytoplasm. Cytoplasm is that gel-like organelle that sort of fills up the interior of a cell. Then there's some kind of membrane, a cell membrane. We also sometimes call it plasma membrane, that sort of encloses it. Usually there are gaps that let things in and out of the cell. no matter what kind of cell we're dealing with, whether it's bacteria or whether it's a human cell, we do have a cell membrane around it. Proteins. All structures of a cell are pretty much made up of proteins. So this makes up our organelles, which I want you to underline because that's really important. And then, of course, without organelles and proteins, we wouldn't have a cell that would even function. Lastly, all living things have some kind of genetic material. So, like heredity that can be passed along. So that means that we have DNA and RNA in that cell. Sometimes it looks a little different. Bacteria, it's circular. In humans, we have chromosomes that are inside a nucleus. But again, there is DNA and there is RNA that helps again replicate. Our last theory that we're going to talk about and then sort of break down is cells come from other pre-existing cells. That means that cells come from actually living cells. And the reason we mentioned the first part, which is no spontaneous generation was the theory that came before cell theory, and it held for 2,000 years. No one wanted to go against Aristotle, who was a great thinker of his time, but he was wrong on this. His theory, or spontaneous generation, said that living things could come from non-living things. In other words, you might have living things coming from like air. And we know now with all of our technology that that's not what happens. Now, organisms that have those cells, they replicate in many ways. And we'll talk more about these in future lessons in this unit. But we have mitosis, meiosis, budding, fragmentation, binary fission. These are just examples of how organisms can replicate and make more cells from their own individual cells. But the main thing that our takeaway is they always originate from a living cell. So if something's dead and the cell is dead, it's not going to be able to make more cells from it. Now, you now have a table in your notes that has prokaryotes and eukaryotes. We're going to focus on prokaryotes first, so please fill in your table utilizing what's in blue. So again, entomology, how do we break down the word? Pro means before, karyo means kernel, nut, whatever it means, but a little compaction, a unit. And so really what we're talking about is the units that are ancient that we think came before, which is why again pro means before, and why we call it prokaryote. Now, prokaryotes, these are made up of only our bacteria kingdoms. So there's only two kingdoms of that, archaebacteria and eubacteria. And then let's look at our key features. So a prokaryote could be either of the kingdoms. There's two of them. It has no nucleus. You'll notice that in our picture and in your picture, it's a jumbled mess of circular DNA that's just sort of floating in the cytoplasm. It's going to be smaller, so much smaller, like 15 times smaller than the other cells of the other type of cell that we'll talk about. It's less complex, or as we say, more simple. There's just not many components to it in comparison to our other cells. And then there's no membrane-bound organelles. In other words, membrane-bound organelles are like chloroplasts and mitochondria that have more complex functions. And prokaryotes or bacteria just don't have those. Now with eukaryotes, look at just how much more things are in these cells. They're so complex. They have so many moving and parts and organelles to fill it up. Now let's talk about the etymology. Eukaryote meaning true. That sort of mainly comes from the fact that our cells as humans are eukaryotic cells. And so we're like, well, these are the true types of cells, not the bacteria cells. They're too simplistic. These are the more complex cells, so therefore they're the true cells. So eukaryote means, again, eu and kernel, so the true kernel, the true sort of building block of an organism. And there are 4 kingdoms that make up this type of cell type: animals, plants, fungi, and protists. And this is where there is a difference between protists being, there are some unicellular protists. In other words, amoebas, and other types of protists out there that are just made up of one cell, but they are so much more complex than the bacteria cells that are also unicellular. Most eukaryotes are multicellular because, again, complex means more complex organism too. Now, these key features, there's 4 kingdoms that make up this type of cell. They all have a nucleus. They all have a nucleus, and that's where the genetic material is stored. They're all larger, like 15 times larger than any bacterial cell, sometimes even larger than that. They're more complex. Just look at how many organelles are in them. And they have membrane-bound organelles. In other words, they have chloroplasts and mitochondria that we'll talk more when we get to our cell energy unit about why those organelles are so important and, again, why they have a membrane. Now, our last sort of part, this is not anything that you have to write down, but we are going to talk a little bit about a virus. So, is a virus alive? We've talked about how it missed out on the reproduction component of the characteristics of living things. But a couple things is it's tiny. It's more tiny than bacteria or any kind of prokaryote or eukaryote. It's tinier than that. It doesn't have all the components that a cell has. So it does have DNA or RNA, but it doesn't have both. It doesn't have a cell membrane. Actually, something like a protein coat of some sort, or a protein shell. Um, and there's not really anything else in it. There's no other moving parts. There's no ribosomes that make proteins. And so it doesn't fit our definition of life. So understand that a virus is even smaller than a bacteria, um, or any other kind of cell. And that makes sense because viruses invade our cells. And to invade them, they take over, they can actually sort of slip in. Okay, we're not done yet. You've finished your notes, but now you need to complete the practice. Don't forget to do that. You're going to take your table that you had with prokaryotes and eukaryotes, find some similarities that you can think of, put that in the middle of your Venn diagram, and then restate what you know about prokaryotes and what you know about eukaryotes. Lastly, you're going to fill out true false based off of what you've learned from this lesson. Take care. Have a great day.